Okay, so our next performer is Tobi Hill-Meyer, who is the director of the first porn film by and for trans women called Doing It Ourselves. Please welcome up Tobi.
I remember when I was required to wear semi-formal dress to debate tournaments. I always resented it because it was back before I transitioned. However, as a result, one friend had the opportunity to see me in a suit. He looked me up and down and said, "Wow, Tobi, you'd make a really hot dyke." I blushed. That was quite a compliment coming from him. It seemed like every dyke on campus thought he was the hottest thing around. It also left quite an impact on me because previously I had decided not to transition because the only model I had seen required being feminine in a way that did not fit for me. He was the one who literally sat me down and said, "You know, Tobi, you can transition and be a butch dyke." The truth is that I was a butch woman long before I actually knew that was possible. I love telling the story of back when my partner Ronan first laid eyes on me in our class on women and militarism. Z read me as a butch woman. Others corrected here when Z asked about me, telling here that I was a guy, but Z turned out to be correct in the long run. It's still something that other people have difficulty understanding. There's pretty obviously a big difference between being a butch dyke and being a masculine guy. But most folks don't stop to think about it and never get past the assumption that all trans women are trying to be as feminine as possible. To them, the idea that a trans woman doesn't want to be femme, would actually want to be butch, is perplexing. One of my lovers recently showed a picture of the two of us to a friend of hers, who hesitantly responded, "Don't take this the wrong way. It's kind of weird, but in this picture, you look like the femme one." Of course, it's because she is a femme, and I'm a butch. But the assumption was so deeply ingrained that even though her friend identifies as a femme, of course I was going to be the more femme one because I'm the trans woman. While visiting a lover in Minneapolis, we went to a community event and I decided to wear fishnets and a leather skirt. It does happen occasionally. While we were there, my lover was talking to, or perhaps bragging to, a friend and asked, "Isn't Tobi so hot?" The friend paused a moment and responded, "I'm really only attracted to women with masculine energy." I wondered how she could be so certain about her read on my energy from across the room and without even talking to me, especially when she was just so wrong. She couldn't have known it at the time, but that was the one time in 6 months or a year that I wore a skirt. And I perform as a drag king, and female masculinity is one of the main ways that I connect to and express my gender. She might have thought that she was being respectful by assuming that I had no masculine energy, because when that concept is applied to trans women, it is most often used against us. Transphobic feminists like to use it as an excuse for keeping us out of women's spaces. Of course, never applying the same standard to cis women. Most egregiously, I once had a friend who was just out of an abusive relationship, when she was turned down from a job for a feminist bookstore because she was trans, or in the coded language they used, had masculine energy. Meanwhile, they kept on the one employee who was sexually harassing every young woman that went into the store. The manager refused to address it, and it got so bad that the other employees didn't feel safe either, and they decided to all quit in protest. I still can't get over the comparison. A trans woman survivor of abuse is a dangerous source of masculine energy that should not be hired, but rampant sexual harassment coming from a cis woman apparently isn't a concern. Despite the fear of masculine energy coming from trans women, it's not hard to see instances where masculinity is highly valued in queer women's community. Masculinity is assumed to be intense and powerful. Trans men are radical and hip. Butch women are transgressive and daring. Masculinity is hot. Masculinity is attractive. Those who are femme are seen as conformists to traditional trappings of something fake and superficial, supposedly ignorantly laboring under a false consciousness and incapable of being effective activists. And because it's deeply ingrained that trans women are super extra femme, or at least trying to be, those same assumptions are often made about us, regardless of how femme we actually are. However, despite this common experience of dismissal, I've noticed when I present butch or genderfuck, I'm able to circumvent some of it. In one instance, I was in a queer and trans space where next to nobody actually already knew me. And I was presenting, not so butch, maybe a little femme. And in conversations around politics, I noticed I was getting spoken over and really just not listened to. People were much more interested in what the trans men had to say. The very next day, with the very same group, I was wearing a much more genderfuck outfit. And it was only then that my voice became important. Meanwhile, I noticed that most of the other trans women were still assumed to not be oppression conscious or were being treated as if they had less to contribute. Now, I have to be careful to make a clear distinction here because what I'm talking about here is masculine privilege, not the so-called residual male privilege that some assume all trans women have. That's an entirely different conversation. It's useful to make those delineations because what privilege I can access from being masculine is clearly limited by other factors, such as being female, being trans, and being gender non-conforming. But it still exists. Being a butch trans woman gives me a useful vantage point on these distinctions. I was once with a group of butches who were trying to explain that they didn't get privilege for being butches. And they compared their experiences to gender conforming people and talked about all the messed up treatment they received for being butch. The point I made was that they weren't being treated that way for being masculine, but for being gender non-conforming. And they just couldn't see the distinction because they only experienced the two at the same time. However, if they were to compare their experience to someone who was gender non-conforming and feminine, well, it would be a lot harder to say that masculinity isn't privileged in our society. I've gotten a chance to explain transmisogyny to queer women's communities plenty of times, and I've noticed an interesting pattern. For instance, this last fall at Butch Voices PDX, I was on a panel of butch trans women. And let me first just say, there was a panel of butch trans women. When I got to talking about how transmisogyny affects me, most of the audience was responding like, that makes a lot of sense. Whereas the few femmes in the audience were much more enthusiastically responding like, right on! Just how my experience with transmisogyny makes it easier for me to understand femmephobia. I think the experience of femmephobia makes it easier to understand transmisogyny. Certainly there are areas where transmisogyny and femmephobia diverge. For example, police brutality, profiling, and treatment in prison. But when it comes to oppression within the queer women's community, they operate along very similar pathways. For example, many of the cis femmes I've talked with have expressed at one point or another frustration with having their status as queer women being dismissed, invalidated, or ignored because they don't look queer or must be dressing that way to attract men. When trans women discuss anxiety about participating in queer women's community, it's almost always the frustration with or fear of being dismissed because of accusations of being interlopers tainted by previously being seen as male. For cis femmes, the emphasis may be on not really being queer, whereas trans women are seen as not really women. But in each case, we're denied full membership within queer women's community. I found a lot of rewarding relationships with cis femmes in my life, especially in how we're capable of mutually supporting each other through experiences of femmephobia and transmisogyny. Over time, I've come to be skeptical, to say the least, of the term ally. There have been so many people who claim to be allies who really don't get it, act entitled, say messed up things, but while connecting with cis femmes as a trans butch, I've gotten to see the best of what that word can mean. I think it's because it's a reciprocal ally relationship rather than being one-sided. I can indulge in questions about medical transition and my body when I get to ask questions about makeup and clothing that I don't understand. I know that they'll correct assumptions about all trans women trying to be 1950s housewives. And I get to tell my friends to stop making fun of the femme who's bringing way too much luggage on a trip. I mean, shoes take up a lot of space when you're not wearing them. And I might be able to pack only one small suitcase, but that's because it's just full of shirts. I'm gonna wear the same black jeans every day. When I've been made to feel shitty about my body or like I don't belong in this community, more often than not, it's been femmes who've given me support. And I've been there when they've been feeling dragged down by how our community treats them. These are individuals who I know have my back when things get bad. Hell, my partner, Ronan, even organized an anti-hate speech campaign, complete with rallies and protests, when our student paper printed transphobic jokes about me. And I'm grateful to be able to return the favor by confronting and shutting down femmephobic remarks expressed by those around me. It may only be a few individual relationships I'm talking about, but together, we create our own little bubble in queer women's community. And slowly, we're expanding it.